Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of Trapped by Love. I'm your host, Emma Carrington. This podcast covers cases of domestic abuse and domestic homicide. So if that's not the kind of content you were looking for, I completely understand. Thanks for stopping by. My aim in covering these cases is to honour the victims of these crimes and to get their stories out there in the hopes of warning others who may face similar situations. So in saying that, I mean absolutely no disrespect to any of the victims or their loved ones. I've done my very best to thoroughly research these cases and to get the details as accurate as possible. The hope is that the more people who recognise the red flags and warning signs of abusive relationships, the less prevalent these cases will be in the future. Knowledge is power, and we need to know what to be on the lookout for so we can protect ourselves and each other. I'd also like to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment below or let me know your thoughts on Twitter at LoveTrapPod. So let's go ahead and get into this week's case. Today's case is that of the suspicious disappearance of Fawn Mountain. Fawn Mountain was born on the 2nd of March in 1987. She grew up and lived most of her life in Altoona, Pennsylvania, with her mum Dorothy and brother Alan. Her home life growing up was dysfunctional, and Fawn was exposed to physical and sexual abuse from family members and family friends. This, of course, caused major trust issues and other trauma responses in Fawn. But despite all the heartache in her life, Fawn always put on a happy face. She loved art and swimming and shopping and was consistently described as a very loyal friend. If she was in your corner and you'd been wronged, she would not stand for it. Unfortunately, due to the trauma in her past, Fawn fell into a pattern of abusive relationships, and this led her to a very abusive partner that resulted in 2 children. This man beat Fawn down over the years, and she was left with very low self-esteem, and she was just miserable in her relationship. She ended up losing custody of her 2 little boys, and this totally devastated her. At this point, due to her prior trauma and this new heartache, Fawn began self-medicating with drugs and alcohol more and more. This in turn led her from one abusive relationship to the next. Being mistreated and abused over and over left her feeling less and less and lower, which just perpetuated the cycle. Fawn fell pregnant with another of these abusive partners, and when her baby girl was stillborn, this broke Fawn's heart. Fawn named her baby girl Caden, and once she was cremated, Caden's ashes were Fawn's most treasured possession. Fawn also had Caden's name with angel wings tattooed on her back. Then, in 2009, Fawn met Heather Dybert. This was her first relationship with a woman, but she felt that they had a strong connection, and the relationship moved very quickly, as most abusive relationships do. And Fawn and Heather's relationship moved so fast that they weren't together too long before Heather was asking Fawn to move in with her. This concerned Fawn's mum, Dorothy. Heather and the situation just made her feel uneasy. Dorothy had noticed a change in her daughter, and it wasn't a comforting, she's so in love type change. Fawn was different, and it didn't sit well with Dorothy. When Fawn told her mum that she was moving in with Heather in Claysburg, she said that she was afraid that she would never be coming back to Altoona, which struck Dorothy as odd because it wasn't like she was moving across the country. She was moving 20 miles away, like a 25-minute drive. After moving around the town of Claysburg, the couple settled into a trailer park next door to Heather's brother Mike and his girlfriend Stephanie. Heather's parents, Mike Sr. and Lois, lived nearby also in East Freedom. They had a butcher shop and their home was attached to the shop. Both Heather and Mike helped out in the family business from time to time. Mike's girlfriend Stephanie was not too keen on Heather. She was very uneasy around her, and when she met Fawn, she was concerned for her because Fawn was such a sweet person. She was so nice and genuine. Stephanie was concerned that she would end up hurt by Heather. From what Stephanie had seen, Heather was quite a volatile person. She was quick to anger. Stephanie had witnessed Heather's outbursts and worried about Fawn. Fawn was a tiny little lady. She stood only 5'1", and even being the Spitfire that she could be, she was definitely no match physically for Heather. And Stephanie knew Heather's temper could quickly turn physical. Heather's difficult temperament made it hard to keep a job or a relationship. She was often out of work, and 4 of her previous relationships had involved either protection from abuse orders or restraining orders. So I think any of us would be worried watching anyone walking into a relationship with someone like that. So once Fawn moved in with Heather, Heather became over the top controlling and possessive of her. She controlled her every move and her every interaction. She rarely let her out of her sight. Heather would even take Fawn to work with her and leave her in the car with the doors locked and the alarm set. Just in case Fawn decided to go anywhere, Heather would be alerted. So of course Fawn wasn't able to get a job because Heather didn't trust her to be at home, let alone out in the world. If Fawn was ever allowed to stay home alone, Heather would padlock the doors to the trailer. Fawn didn't have a mobile phone, and the trailer's landline only received calls from what I can work out. Of course, if ever Fawn was left at home, Heather would direct any incoming calls to her own mobile to further limit Fawn's access to the outside. Fawn was isolated and becoming more and more depressed. She spent the majority of her time either locked in the trailer or locked in Heather's car, without any contact with anyone but Heather, who she was completely reliant on. Fawn had nowhere to go. She didn't have any money. Even if she had realised she was in an abusive relationship, which she probably didn't because she'd been conditioned from such an early age to see control and abuse as love. But even if she had recognised it for what it was, she had no idea where to turn to for help. But Fawn didn't see the flaws in her relationship for what they were. She believed that Heather did what she did because she cared and because she wanted to protect Fawn. She didn't see it for the possessive and controlling abuse that it was. And control quickly progressed to verbal abuse. Then not long later, it became physical. Fawn's mother Dorothy noticed marks on her daughter's neck that Fawn was trying to hide by wearing a hoodie. When Dorothy pressed her for an explanation as to what happened, Fawn told her that Heather had choked her, that she'd come home drunk and held Fawn down and choked her with a rope. Now I'm going to stop right here for a public service announcement. I'm going to wave my red flag and give you the statistics. Someone who has been choked, strangled, throttled, or put in a chokehold by their intimate partner is 7 times more likely to be killed by their spouse. This is a huge precursor to intimate partner homicide. Please, if you know of someone who is in this sort of situation, or if you yourself find yourself facing this, please find someone you can talk to so you can make a safety plan and get out. Because no one deserves to live like that, or worse, die like that. Okay, with all that said, back to Fawn's case. This instance of choking was not the first or the last time that Heather had hurt Fawn. Fawn suffered injuries at her hands many times. She was admitted to the emergency room so many times that Heather eventually started taking her to different hospitals because the hospital staff began asking too many questions about Fawn's safety at home. They could clearly see that her injuries were from abuse. But Fawn felt stuck. She didn't have any way to look after herself. She didn't drive. She didn't even have a phone. So she stayed, and they just did the rounds of the hospitals to avoid too many questions. Fawn finally seemed to realise the dangerous situation that she was in and tried a number of times to get away from Heather. Now, if you know anything about abusive relationships, you know trying to get away is easier said than done. And it is also the most dangerous time. An abuser doesn't like to lose control of the victim. For Fawn, this meant literal escape from the trailer while Heather wasn't looking, or to attempt to break out while she wasn't home. Can you imagine the fear? For so long now, Fawn would have been doing everything within her power not to upset this person, and now she is deliberately going out of her way to do something that will upset the person who has put her in the hospital multiple times. Every fibre of her being must have been screaming at her to not make waves, to just stay safe. But she obviously also knew that she would never be truly safe if she didn't get away. So when she did get out, Fawn would often go to Mike and Stephanie's trailer next door. Stephanie was always there for her, and Fawn would go over to ask for a ride to her mum's house or to borrow the phone so she could call someone to come and get her. Fawn always ran back to her mum's home. She was all she had, and they loved each other. But as most adults are, Fawn was resistant when Dorothy gave her opinion on her daughter's relationship. Dorothy is also said to have had some cognitive difficulties, which makes it hard for her to assess the full picture of a situation. And although she knew Fawn was in a bad and potentially dangerous relationship, because of these difficulties, she didn't really know how to go about helping her. Now, as I said before, leaving an abusive relationship is easier said than done. And if ever Fawn did escape and make her way back to her mum's house or even to a friend's, Heather would find her and find a way to get her back. If you've ever been in this situation, you'd know this can be anything from roses and promises to threats to your family. Finally, in 2011, while Fawn was back in Heather's control, Heather took her to work and locked her in the car as usual and set the alarm. But Fawn decided she was going to run away. Once she knew Heather was away from the car and inside work, she opened the car door and took off running as fast as she could. She found a phone and called a friend, Jackie, to come and pick her up. Now, Jackie was going to take Fawn to her mum's house, but first Fawn wanted to stop off at the trailer so she could get a few things. Now, I know what you're thinking. No! And me too, I'm right there with you. Don't do it unless you have a police escort. It's not safe. But the reason that they were making this stop was for Fawn's daughter's ashes, because in the past, when she'd left, Heather had threatened to dump them out. So yeah, this woman is completely evil. Fawn is acting on emotion at this point, and when she gets to the trailer, she realizes she doesn't have the keys. So she decides to break in to get the urn. Of course, because no doubt Heather has eyes everywhere in that trailer park, she finds out about this and reports the break-in to police. So, ridiculously, Fawn was charged with breaking and entering into her own property, along with felony burglary of her own possessions and trespassing, just for good measure. She was ordered to pay $2,700 in fines, which of course was next to impossible considering she had limited income, and she was placed on probation. Then, in a bizarre turn of events, Dorothy gets a restraining order in the mail, not from Heather, but from Fawn. Now, this is a hard one to understand because generally you would have to apply personally for a restraining order. And in my opinion, I would say Fawn did. Whether this was under duress or under coercion, Fawn applied for that restraining order, but Heather was behind it. She was making sure that Fawn had nowhere to go. Fawn was now not allowed to leave the trailer at all without permission. She also wasn't allowed to have anyone there. Heather had complete control and Fawn was completely isolated. Stephanie tried everything to help Fawn, and because their trailers were right beside each other, they were able to talk through the window while Heather was out. She was a huge support for Fawn. In those secret conversations, Fawn confided how desperately she wanted to get away from Heather. She just didn't know how it was ever going to be possible. Stephanie understood Fawn's situation and the feeling of not being able to break free from the abuse because Mike, Heather's brother, who Stephanie lived with, was also very controlling and abusive. It also seemed that Heather's parents were involved to an extent in the abuse as well. They helped to keep watch on Fawn because one day Heather's mother drove past the trailer and saw Fawn and Stephanie talking through the window, and she told Heather, and Heather went ahead and boarded up the windows. This may have prevented Fawn and Stephanie's conversations, but it didn't keep the sound of the couple's violent fights from reaching the neighbours. The police attended the trailer time and time again, with no charges or repercussions ever being doled out, despite the fact that many witnesses reported seeing Heather choke Fawn, unconscious, in the front yard on more than one occasion. When Fawn got up the courage to run away again, and I know I'm saying run away, and in a lot of these cases we say things like running away, but this isn't a child running away from home. She's an adult, and she should be able to walk away from a relationship that she no longer wants to be in without being chased down. Sorry, I'm ranting again. But in this instance, that's exactly what Heather did. She chased her down, and she almost ran her over with her truck. Fawn ran into a neighbour's house for help, but Heather followed her and physically dragged her out and back to the trailer. This happened over and over again. Every time Fawn would try and get away, Heather would hunt her down and drag her back. Fawn was so desperate in October of 2012, she tried to go back to her mum's house despite the restraining order still being in effect. Of course, Heather wasn't going to let her go that easily. So she called the police to advise them of the breach of the restraining order, and the police went to Dorothy's home and arrested her. Because of this, Dorothy spent 2 days in jail, which is absolutely ridiculous. She was in her own home. So infuriating. And of course, Fawn ended up right back where she started, in the trailer. Once Dorothy was released, all she could do was call in a welfare check for her daughter. She was so worried. In the end, the police told her, "We've checked on your daughter and she's fine." And that's all that they do. The last documented welfare check on Fawn was in November of 2012. Fawn then spent Thanksgiving with Heather's family, of course. The following weekend, Heather and Fawn, Mike and Stephanie all went over to help clean the family's butcher shop in preparation for Monday when hunting season started. They washed down, bleached and sterilised the whole shop. As payment, Mike Sr. passed out beer and everyone sat around and had a few drinks and a chat. Fawn was having a great time and this seemed to be really annoying Heather. She didn't like Fawn to drink anyway, but to see Fawn in good spirits, happy and talking about how she was getting off probation soon and would be able to go out to her favourite club and whatnot seemed to be making Heather mad, according to Stephanie. When they left, they all headed back to the trailer park and Heather helped Mike take something into his place, giving Fawn and Stephanie a couple of minutes to talk. And Fawn said she planned on relaxing and watching some scary movies before bed. Heather and Mike came back and the two couples went to their separate trailers. Unfortunately, this was the last time anyone would ever see Fawn. On Monday, the 26th of November, Lois and Mike Sr. came by the trailer in the morning to pick up Mike and Stephanie to take them back to help out at the shop again. And when they arrived, Heather was outside having a cigarette. So they stopped to have a chat with her while they waited for Stephanie and Mike. When Mike and Stephanie came out, they thought it was a bit odd that Heather was out the front on her own. Fawn was always with Heather. She had no autonomy at all. Heather didn't like to let her out of her sight. So Stephanie asked where Fawn was, and Heather casually said that she'd gotten up at 3 a.m. to go to the bathroom and hadn't been able to find Fawn. She'd looked everywhere, but she was just gone. However, Heather wasn't freaking out or behaving the way she had every other time Fawn had left. Then Mike leaned over and whispered jokingly, "I bet Heather killed her." And even though she knew it was just a joke in poor taste, that's when Stephanie said she knew something was very wrong. She knew that if Fawn had been trying to get away, she would have come to her, but she hadn't. She hadn't told her anything that would indicate that she was going to run. So now, after 6 years of chasing Fawn down anytime she left, Heather didn't really seem to care that Fawn was gone. She didn't harass the neighbours or Fawn's friends or call the police on her mum to report a violation to the restraining order or call her mum at all to even see if Fawn was there. She just put her hands up and went, "Oh well." Stephanie thought this was sus as, and I'm with her on that. To add to this, Fawn left in the middle of the night, in the dead of winter, in Pennsylvania, with nothing. She took nothing, not even her daughter's ashes. Every other time she's left, her very first thought is to retrieve those ashes before her tormentor could dump them out, as she constantly threatened to do. But not this time. Again, sus as. Stephanie called Dorothy to check and see if Fawn was over there, and when Dorothy said no, she explained that Fawn was missing. As soon as she heard this, Dorothy called the police. They, of course, very helpfully told her that Fawn was an adult and they couldn't file a missing persons report. Meanwhile, in the week after Fawn had gone missing, Mike Sr. came over to Heather's trailer and helped her completely remodel it. By the way, this wasn't a trailer that she owned. She was only renting it, but took it upon herself to remove carpet and remove subflooring, all on the spur of the moment, in the middle of winter, right before Christmas. I'm going to go with that's a little odd. They also put in a dog run in the backyard with a concrete slab, which is weird. Most dogs prefer grass, don't they? Anyway, they put in concrete, and they never actually completed this, but they did pour the slab. And a week after they'd done their little reno project, Heather packed herself up and moved to Ohio. Within 2 months, she'd found herself a new girlfriend, who she then brought back to Pennsylvania. 6 months after Fawn went missing, Heather's family closed and sold their butcher shop. They also sold off all the equipment. Now that Heather was back, people were asking about Fawn, but Heather gave them all sorts of different stories. She told some that Fawn was in prison in Ohio, and that when the police had called to release her back home, Heather had refused. Other times she told people that the prison was in Arizona, and then there was still that original story that Fawn had left in the middle of the night. Dorothy was still trying to get the police to help her in locating her daughter, but they were less than accommodating and seemed to take advantage of her cognitive difficulties to just fob her off and confuse her. Dorothy thought that they had all the information, so that meant that a report had been filed. That, of course, was not the case. In April of 2015, Fawn's uncle was trying to locate her because her stepfather was in the hospital and asking to see her. But when he got in contact with Heather, she didn't even tell him that Fawn had left, let alone that she was missing. When a family friend turned up on Heather's doorstep, she finally told them that Fawn had left years ago. Dorothy contacted the Department of Social Security and let them know that Fawn was probably not receiving her welfare checks. So they sent Fawn a notice telling her that she had to come in for a face-to-face meeting in order to continue receiving welfare payments. When she didn't come in, this is when police would finally file the missing persons report. Yeah, finally. 3 years later. So the police are involved now, which is great. You'd think it'd be pretty easy to connect these dots, right? Well, police interviewed everyone who knew Fawn, took their statements, had them sign these statements, and that was about the extent of it. Top policing there. It wasn't until June of 2017 that Fawn's cousin Bridget found out she was missing. The cousins had been really close growing up, but had lost touch over the years. So for the 5 years now that Fawn had been missing, Bridget had no idea. As soon as she found out, she reached out to Dorothy and asked her what had happened. She got the rundown on the relationship with Heather and all that Fawn had endured through that. Dorothy told Bridget about Stephanie trying to help Fawn, so Bridget reached out to Stephanie and they got in contact. Stephanie had been so worried for the past 5 years and gave Bridget all the information that she could. Stephanie and Bridget talked for 5 hours, but it really didn't take long for Bridget to realise just how bad of a situation Fawn had been in with Heather. Stephanie gave names and contact details of anyone else who might be able to help, and Bridget began ringing around, only to be told by these people that they'd given statements to police. However, when she questioned the police about these statements and all the information they had from their investigation, she was told that all these records were gone. Bridget came to the same conclusion as I'm sure you have at this point. This investigation was half-assed at best. There were so many things that could have been followed up on that just weren't. So many things didn't add up, but the police obviously didn't care. When Bridget pressed them for further information, she was told the officer assigned to Fawn's case was no longer with the department, and her case had not been reassigned. So no one had been looking into it since this officer was fired years earlier. At this point, I'm really impressed with the Greenfield Township Police Department, aren't you? Anyway, at this point, the police told Bridget that they'd get back to her once they worked out what was going on and how they were going to move forward. But I'm sure you can guess that even though she waited, Bridget heard nothing. So she called them back and demanded answers. This is when they finally told her that they had no one on the case and wouldn't be putting anyone on it. And they also confirmed that any statements and information that the first investigation, again I use that word lightly, anything that investigation yielded was indeed gone. I'm wondering if the original officer that worked on the case has been asked if he knows where the documents are. Anyway, so Bridget did a whole lot of investigation on her own. She called around to all the jails and prisons that Heather had said Fawn had been in, but none of these institutions had any record of Fawn. Then, in August of 2017, the state police ended up getting involved, and Bridget was happy that someone was finally doing something. She said that they're so much better to work with. She's working closely with Trooper Martini, who's in charge of the case right now. Now, as much as we can say Heather's involvement in this case is sus as, there wasn't any clear evidence for the police to be able to name her a person of interest officially. They do, however, say that they suspect foul play. Heather's abusive ways didn't end with Fawn's disappearance. Her new partner, who ended up marrying Heather, eventually moved out and filed a restraining order on her. Of course, Heather thought she was above the law, but this time she was arrested and charged with felony strangulation. However, after pleading guilty to lesser charges, she was only given 24 months of probation for this. This just blows my mind. Strangulation. In the fall of 2017, Heather was evicted from the trailer and proceeded to strip out everything she possibly could. Things like light fixtures and wirings, the most random things. There were witnesses to her doing this who are so afraid of her that they want to remain anonymous. Once Heather had vacated the property, the police went in to search. Finally. They even brought in cadaver dogs and they excavated the concrete slab in the backyard, thinking they might find remains. But unfortunately, nothing came of their searches. Not long after this, the trailer went up in flames. There was plenty of speculation and rumours that Heather had done this for obvious reasons. But it turns out that it was actually the trailer's owner who did this, basically because Heather had left it uninhabitable. It was in such bad condition that they just torched it. I don't really know what to say about that. I'm obviously nowhere near local to this area, so I have no idea of common practices. All I have to say on that is Pennsylvania, you do you, because that is super weird to me. Is that weird? Anyway, I digress. Sorry, Pennsylvania. I know, I'm sure the majority of you aren't going around lighting your dwellings on fire if you've got bad wiring. Since 2018, Bridget has had a Facebook page, Bring Fawn Marie Home, to raise awareness, and it has been steadily growing. In May of this year, they had a candlelight vigil where they were raising money for billboards to keep the focus on Fawn's case in the local area. And then on the 4th of October this year, the Fawn Marie Army hosted a block party. They had t-shirts and yard signs and bracelets that people could purchase in an effort to raise awareness and also funds for a reward. They chose October for this event because it's Domestic Violence Awareness Month in the United States. And of course, Fawn went missing in the midst of a very violent and controlling relationship. If you have any information about Fawn's disappearance, please reach out to law enforcement. The state police are still handling the case to the best of my knowledge. All details for the Facebook group will be in the show notes or the description box below. They are also, like I said, raising money for a reward. So I have also linked the GoFundMe down below and in the show notes as well. Please share Fawn's story. Keep the focus and the pressure on this one, please, guys. It's been 9 years that she's been missing. It's absolutely heartbreaking for the family to not know what has happened to their loved one. So let's try and get the word out and get some more information that can shed some light. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this case. So please don't forget to like and subscribe, rate and review, and drop a comment below for my friends watching on YouTube. Let's also continue the discussion over on social media. Join us on Twitter at LoveTrapPod or Instagram at Surviving the Love Bomb. Trapped by Love is a Surviving the Love Bomb production. If you'd like more information about recognizing abusive relationships, please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel, Surviving the Love Bomb. You can also watch these podcasts on the Trapped by Love YouTube channel. I believe this is a really important topic that needs more exposure so we can all stay safe from abusive relationships. Well, that's all I have for you. I thank you for joining me this week. And until next time, please take care of yourselves and be kind to one another.